Today, the Kremlin almost regularly makes threats in the media that, if necessary, it could use nuclear weapons, including on the territory of Ukraine. The recent tests of a ballistic missile, which the Russians named Oreshnik, are direct evidence that they have such plans. However, it may be sensational news for some, but in fact, Moscow has already carried out nuclear explosions on the territory of Ukraine. And today I will tell you about one of them. The scale of the damage was colossal, but as always, it was covered up. So get ready, this information will be a complete shock for you. The crime was committed in 1979, and the most terrible consequences are yet to be felt. In August 1963, a treaty was signed between the USSR and the USA banning nuclear weapons testing in the air, in space, and underwater. However, the Soviet Union found a peculiar loophole in the signed treaty, because just 2 years later it began a program of underground nuclear tests, supposedly in the interests of the national economy. This program was given the name Energy of the Peaceful Atom. So the Chernobyl disaster may not be the most terrible democratic catastrophe on Ukrainian soil. I'm Semyon from Megashi TV, starting now. Similar precedents in the past. Let's follow the old Soviet tradition and first take a look at what the capitalists did regarding nuclear weapons testing before the agreement was signed. In 1957, the United States launched a project that involved using low-yield nuclear explosions for industrial and construction purposes. Over the following years, 27 experimental explosions were carried out. For comparison, in the Soviet Union, until 1988, when the peaceful nuclear energy program was shut down, 124 explosions were conducted. Yes, all this happened in the very same country that from every screen, postcard and poster proclaimed peace to the world, sang Stork on the Roof, Peace on Earth, and Sunny World. Yes, 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 to a nuclear explosion, no, yes, yes. This is in the very same country where nuclear weapons were tested 5 times more often than in the aggressive United States. And keep in mind, 124 is the number we know of, not ruling out the possibility that there were unrecorded or classified tests. By the way, 2 out of those 124 were conducted on the territory of Ukraine. Chronicle of events. In the USSR, it was decided to carry out a nuclear explosion at the Yunyi Kommunar mine in the city of Yuno-Komunarovsk, Donetsk region in 1979. But first, a few words about the mine itself. It was opened back in the pre-Soviet period, in 1970, in the vicinity of the city of Yanakievo. And in 1940 it was even recognized as the best mine in the entire Soviet Union. 20 years before the year 1989 that we're discussing, the Yunkom mine became the leader in one negative ranking. During this period, there were more than 230 methane and coal dust explosions, and every 8th one resulted in the death of miners. About 42% of the coal seams that were being mined at that time were located in areas of tectonic faults, which made the miners' work extremely dangerous. The task of reducing gas contamination and the frequency of accidents was assigned to Nikolai Konstantinovich Gorenko, who at that time was the deputy minister of the coal industry of the USSR. It was decided to carry out a controlled nuclear explosion at a depth of 900 meters between the coal seams called Devyatka and Kirpichny. The goal was to eliminate the cavities filled with accumulated gas. This would allow further expansion of the mine's operations. The experiment was named Project Klivazh. The word Klivazh itself is of French origin and translates to stratification or splitting. The essence of this term is the splitting of rock formations into thin sheets or plates under the pressure of the Earth's crust. On the day of the actual explosion, which was scheduled for September 16, 1979, soldiers from the Donbas military units were not allowed to participate in the control and security. Military personnel and Ministry of Internal Affairs officers from the RSFSR were brought in for this. The residents of Yuno-Komunarovsk, by the way, the city has now been given back its original name, Bunge, claimed that on September 15 they were told to leave their homes the next day. Some of the townspeople were told that the reason for the temporary evacuation was a civil defense drill. Others were told about some kind of blasting operations. The next morning, buses were brought in for the evacuation and people were taken 10 kilometers out of the city into the fields. However, most of the citizens stayed in their homes because they didn't know that the explosion would be nuclear. They simply forgot to mention that. A minor detail, isn't it? According to various sources, the explosion itself took place either at 9 a.m. or at 12 noon. By evening, buses had already returned people to their homes, and by the next morning, the mine resumed its operations as usual, as if nothing had happened. At the same time, the workers and residents didn't even know what had actually happened at their workplace the day before. Then, the deceitful Soviet official sources reported that the experiment was successful, resulting in a cavity with a radius of about 6 meters, and that radiation levels were at background levels. After the explosion, the gas content of the mine was reduced almost threefold. The mine operated until 2002 and was closed during the time of Ukraine, and that's it. So, if you only study the official sources, everything seems smooth and perfect. But today I rely on the opinions of experts, declassified documents, and eyewitness testimony to shed light on what really happened that day. And most importantly, what was the real goal and what consequences did it lead to, in reality? The real reason for the experiment. To begin with, let's turn to the testimonies of eyewitnesses. Those who stayed in their homes at the moment of the explosion felt the ground shake beneath their feet. Here are the memories of one of the residents. Loudspeakers announced, "Everyone must leave their homes and take their documents." People from the 5-story buildings were taken to a pioneer camp. I stayed, and when the explosion happened, it felt like being punched in the back, and then cracks appeared in many houses. According to the information that was established, the size of the shell itself was about 2 meters long and up to 80 centimeters in diameter. The power of the shell itself is estimated at 200 to 300 kilograms in TNT equivalent. As a result, after the explosion, a body filled with radioactive isotopes formed underground, resembling a sphere, and inside this 30-meter cavity, all the products of radioactive decay were preserved. At the same time, the thickness of the walls of this sphere is about 1 meter. By analyzing the facts that I'm about to tell you, I can clearly state that the real goal, not the one written on paper, was definitely not to reduce harm to the miners. In fact, the goal was of a military nature. That is exactly why everything related to this experiment has been classified for more than 45 years and still remains in the military archives in Moscow. The real objective of the experiment was to test nuclear weapons while bypassing the very ban I mentioned at the beginning of this video. In fact, before this, all similar tests, which were also presented as peaceful projects, took place in remote corners of the Union. And this was the first explosion of its kind in such a densely populated region. Let me remind you that the population of Donbass in 1979 was about 7.5 million people. Well, that's all. The explosion supposedly didn't cause any harmful effects on the very day of the experiment, but people had to deal with its consequences for the next 45 years. And unfortunately, in this regard, the worst is still ahead. The impact of radiation and the results of the experiment. They tried their best to keep quiet about how the nuclear explosion affected those who continued working in the mine for another 23 years after that. It was not in the interest of the local authorities, let alone the central ones, to talk about the health problems that ordinary people faced. But these problems existed and were very common. People constantly sought help. They were losing their hair, had regular diarrhea and vomiting with blood, nausea, dizziness, headaches, and fever. The doctors just shrugged, unsure what was happening or how to help. Cases like these among miners at first numbered in the dozens and then in the hundreds each year. After the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, doctors, having reviewed the medical records of residents of Yunkom from 1980 to 1985, came to a clear conclusion. Based on all the outward signs of the illnesses, it was radiation sickness. According to Anatoly Dagaev, a miner from Yunkom, people get sick very often, cancer. Many people lose the use of their legs. Personally, I have major problems with my left leg. And what about the coal cutter? Sergei Glaskov, who worked at the mine in its last years of operation and later became a guard at the closed Yunkom, claims that none of those who worked at the mine in 1979 are still alive. Even according to official data, the number of accidents at the mine after September 1979 decreased by only 10%. It turns out that despite the experiment being called successful in official sources, if we assume its goal was to reduce the number of accidents, it had almost no effect on that number. I'm sometimes shocked by the way the USSR zombies think. One official source says it decreased threefold, and another says that accidents decreased by 10%. But it's just simple math. How can people be so blind? It's just another argument that Klivazh's goals were military. At the beginning of the next year, 1980, the Olympic year, there was another release of gas coal mixture, which resulted in the deaths of 2 miners. After examining the available data, a number of experts criticized Klivazh's experiment, since it was extremely dangerous for the population. They in turn proposed other methods that were more effective. In particular, by analyzing the sounds from coal cracking, it was possible to predict when the next methane outburst might occur. According to their conclusions, the power of the explosion was not sufficient to solve the problem. However, if the power had been greater, the consequences could have been much more serious for a huge number of people, both in Yanakievo and in the surrounding areas. Comparable to the consequences of the Hiroshima explosion in 1945. At that time, the coal industry in the decaying West had a developed network of warnings about possible accidents, such as seismic acoustic forecasting and gas level detectors. Soviet great mines were detonating nuclear bombs. Any reasonable person understands that trying to solve such a problem in this way is like filling potholes in the road with depleted uranium. By the way, if anyone thinks I just gave some unbelievable example just to exaggerate, that's actually not the case. If anyone ever drove through the Dnipropetrovsk region, they saw those interesting famous green highways. So, these roads were made in the spirit of waste not, want not from the byproducts of ferroalloy plants, which clearly didn't do any good for the health of the people of Dnipro at the time. Let me digress a bit and prove with facts to those who think that in the Soviet Union the grass was greener, the sausage was cheaper, and the ice cream tasted better, and now they say everything is worse. So, before the experiment itself, many residents of Yunkom still shudder when they remember the frequent funerals of their fellow townspeople. And after the explosion itself, cases of an unknown disease started to appear as well. And this is just one case out of hundreds, maybe even thousands in Soviet history. So, I have a legitimate question. Was that ice cream, which cost 19 kopecks, really that important? Is its supposed cheapness really that important if thousands of dead miners and Chernobyl disaster liquidators will never get to eat that ice cream? By the way, hundreds of thousands who died in operations carried out in the name of international duty, millions who perished in the Gulag camps, and tens of millions who were starved to death will also never taste its amazing flavor. Yes, cheap ice cream is a proven fact, but so are the premature deaths of millions, or rather the murder of millions of people, that is also a proven fact. So, how do you feel living with this information now, fans of Soviet ice cream? Consequences. When radiation became a threat to the local population, the authorities, as the Soviet Empire neared its end, decided to check radiation levels in the Yunkom area. The production association UKR Uglegeologia was tasked with conducting the research. In 1990 and 1991, 2 boreholes were drilled. One reached the spherical body itself, while the other was drilled 8 meters to the side. Scientists found that the residual radioactive contamination was at the level of 60 curies, which significantly exceeded the permissible norm and was comparable to Chernobyl. Soil with natural content of uranium, thorium and potassium-40 can have an activity of about 0.1 to 0.2 microcuries. And after 11 years there were 60 curies there, or, to help you better understand the scale, that's 60 million microcuries. Simple math that propaganda can't change. In 2002 the mine was closed due to, again, numerous accidents and inefficiency. It was preserved using the dry method, unlike most of the surrounding mines, which were usually just flooded. This required additional annual funding to pump out groundwater that could flood the mine. However, the Ukrainian authorities agreed to this, understanding all the problems that could arise if the mine water were to get into rivers used for drinking water. However, none of this was necessary at all, and it was alien to the occupiers who came to the land of Donbass after 2014. The Council of the self-proclaimed DPR decided that the budget did not provide for pumping. Well, that's right, because expenses are not income. And women will give birth to more, and it basically doesn't matter who. And they stopped this process in 2018. The authorities of Ukraine, although they kept silent about the problem left from the Soviet Union, spared no expense to avoid turning Donbass into another exclusion zone like Chernobyl. Ukrainian nuclear energy specialists in that same 2018 warned about a large-scale environmental danger that could lead to the flooding of the mine. But who would listen in the quasi-state of the Ukrainian Nazis? The authorities of the young republic presented everything under the pretense that comprehensive scientific research is being conducted by leading institutes of the DPR. Apparently, such institutes exist. They concluded that immersion in water would not lead to environmental pollution or a radiation threat. It's all so simple, and you were worried. Since 2014, the Ukrainian side has repeatedly submitted requests to the IAEA. However, the Russians did not want to allow specialists to inspect the condition of the mine itself and the level of radioactive contamination. In fact, at the moment it is impossible to monitor the situation at the site of the flooded Yunkom. And now let's think logically. What could happen next? Unfissioned radioactive atoms begin to get into the water, and with the river and tributary system they can reach the Secrecy Donetsk, from which 3 regions take their water: Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kharkiv. But the most dangerous thing is if this contaminated water gets into the Kalmius River. And mind you, this is a river that flows into the Sea of Azov, the sea that connects to the Black Sea through the Kerch Strait. Thus, this is the picture. Not only the southern and eastern regions of Ukraine become uninhabitable, but the entire Black Sea coast of Europe as well. In 2020, the head of the Ukrainian Verkhovna Rada delegation at the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly meeting in Vienna reported that as of the beginning of the year, the Yunkom mine was already flooded with radioactive water. And according to the most recent data, dated last summer, the total concentration of radionuclides in the aquifers of the surrounding area, specifically at a sampling point 5 kilometers from the mine, ranges from 20 to 34,000 becquerels per kilogram. These units are used to measure the activity of a radioactive source. What does this number mean? It means, at the very least, that by the middle of 2024 the contaminated water had already reached the drinking water aquifers. What is happening there now, and what should we expect this year or next? We can only guess. Conclusions. Thus, it can be stated that the Kremlin authorities are twice responsible for what happened and what continues to happen around this situation. To begin with, they conducted a nuclear test in an area where millions of people live, hiding it all and presenting it as if it was the only way to solve the issue. And now the Russian Federation, whose puppet was the DPR and which has now supposedly become part of Russia, bears full responsibility for letting the situation slide and putting tens of millions of people in Eastern Europe at risk. According to even the most optimistic studies, within the next 2 decades, drinking water in this region and the surrounding areas may become unfit for consumption, and as a result, this territory will no longer be suitable for habitation. Russia, having come to these lands under beautiful slogans, in reality is not solving anything. The consequences of using a far from peaceful atom which they themselves provoked in the past are still present, and they continue to threaten the whole world with nuclear weapons. I think that just from this one case you can clearly understand what the Russian world really is. The more I study history, the more convinced I become that when the Russian world starts interfering in people's lives, the more problems and suffering await them. And after all, there are many failed experiments and their consequences that we still don't know about to this day. And to my great regret, it will be our children, or maybe even our grandchildren, who will have to deal with all of this. After all, how many more of these nuclear time bombs are hidden in the former Soviet Union? No one knows. But I will try to shed light on all the dark affairs of both the Soviet and Russian authorities. Thank you for watching. And I hope you'll write in the comments whether you learned something new today and what your thoughts are about the information I shared. Goodbye, everyone.